Good morning, viewers. I welcome you all in this brand new episode of Crit Talks with Dr. Anand Kulkarni. In the last episode, we have tried to map very basic concepts like literature and, of course, literary criticism. This has set a foundation for what we are going to discuss in the coming episodes. In today's episode, we are going to concentrate on a particular issue of classicism, or what generally is called as classical criticism. This is a very important one because we keep on talking about these issues again and again, even we are now in postmodern conditions. I welcome Dr. Kulkarni. I also welcome my co-host Ghanshyam Borate. To begin with, sir, I have two questions for you. The first question is about the very suffix that we use, ism, with different words. So what does this ism actually mean? Because we keep referring to classicism, we keep referring to romanticism, even modernism for that matter. So what exactly literature of students of literature should understand this suffix in what way? This is my first question. The second question is about classical criticism. That whenever we think about classical criticism, we generally have this assumption that it began with Plato. Plato's Republic gave us some first instances of literary appreciation and literary evaluation. Was there anything before Plato that in a way hinted about this entire business of criticism? So these are my two questions to begin with.
Good morning, Dr. Pranav Ratnaparthi and Professor Shyam Borate and viewers as well. We have two questions to answer today to begin with. One is about ism and the other is about the beginning of literary criticism in classical period.
Correct.
So ism is actually a kind of theorization. It is setting the doctrines together. And it has three main parts. One is, it is a kind of proposition of set of ideas, set of principles, some doctrines, some notions. Second is the explication or the explanation. And the third is the methodology, the tools, the techniques which are useful for the application.
Right.
These are the three important parts of ism. Ism actually springs from philosophy. It is more philosophical because it is notional, because it tries to put forward, propose, propound particular perspective. And if a particular perspective or approach is to be proposed, then it is necessary that it should be substantiated. So ism is meant for that. Ism is both ideological and polemical. That is, you have a particular ideology, a particular set of doctrines or ideas, and at the same time, it needs to be circulated among the people so that they can have the attention of the perspective. There have been a lot of isms, and of course, philosophy is supposed to be the mother of all disciplines in the world, at least in the European sense of the term. So isms have been there. And isms have been there in large number, mostly in the humanities, in social sciences, in languages, and in philosophy and all other subjects which come under the rubric called humanities. This, I think, is enough for our understanding of ism.
Right.
We shall move towards the next question, and it is about the beginning before Plato, beginning of criticism before Plato. Or do we think that Plato is that literary criticism in classical period begins with Plato? Plato is not literary critic in the established sense of the term. The reason is that he's basically a philosopher. And literature or poetry, for that matter, comes as a secondary issue for him. And it comes because it works as a negative force in the kind of world that he wanted to build. So he looks upon poetry or literature from the secondary point of view. His approach is ancillary, his approach is not primary, whereas philosophy is his primary concern. But it is not true, ideally speaking, that literary criticism begins with Plato, though Plato was able to formulate some of the important objections against poetry. To that extent, we can say that Plato was successful in formulating very serious charges against poetry and literature in general. But if we want to take a historical review, we have to go back to Xenophanes, the Greek writer and thinker, who for the first time raised questions about poetry, and the questions were about the sincerity and authenticity of the representation in Homer's poetry. He raised questions against Homer's poetry and Hesiod's poetry. We all know that Homer is the fountainhead poet of Greek civilization. Homer acquires such an important place. But Xenophanes' objections were that Homer had depicted Greek gods in very abusive terms. That Homer had equated gods with the villains, and he assigned all worst qualities to the gods, which according to Xenophanes was not acceptable. So on moral grounds at least, and less on artistic grounds, Xenophanes was raising some very important doubts against reflections in poetry. So you can call Xenophanes to be the first troublemaker in Greek literary criticism, and he clearly anticipates Plato. It is with Plato, of course. So historically, Xenophanes can be treated to be the first literary critic, though on a very small scale. Then we move towards Plato. And Plato, we all know that Plato came out with some very serious and very damaging charges against poetry. The reasons were obvious, of course. Before we turn towards Plato, I think I would like to give you three important ideas that Plato was raising against. The first important idea that he talked about was about the inspiration and wisdom. There was a kind of duality, a kind of opposition between inspiration and wisdom. Next was about appearance and reality. And in both cases, you shall see, he was against appearance and he was for reality. He was against inspiration and he was for wisdom. And still more importantly, the last one, reason and emotion. These were the three important binaries. In the modern sense, we can use this term. These were the three important notional oppositions that Plato came out with against poetry. And his propositions against poetry were, as I earlier pointed out, were mostly philosophical and education related. Plato never thought of poetry in the artistic sense of the term. He did not bother about the art, poetry as an art. He did not bother about the aesthetics in poetry. He did not bother about literary issues or poetic issues involved in poetry. He was bothered about the application of poetry or contribution of poetry towards building the ideal state. We all know that he was more of a philosopher and he wanted to build an ideal state. This was the background that we have to understand. And one more thing is this, that he was always in search of knowledge. To use the Greek word episteme, he was in search of knowledge and truth and beauty. And he found that poetry was not helping in any way in building this kind of epistemology, this kind of field of knowledge, which he thought was necessary for an ideal state. So we have to understand that Plato was not the literary critic in the established sense of the term. Second, Plato did not treat poetry the way poetry should have been treated. This is, of course, our approach towards Plato. As the students of literature and teachers of literature or researchers of literature, perhaps, we have our own reservations against the charges that Plato raised. But Plato was right in his own sense of the term, because Plato was trying to establish an ideal state of the things, He was idealistic, we all know. He was less pragmatic, more idealistic compared to Aristotle. and he always believed in things which were beyond our sensory perceptions. So that is another concern that we have to understand. Coming back to the point that I raised earlier, that there have been some binaries. One of the binaries is, to begin with, inspiration. Plato argued, you shall see in different works of Plato, there have been some scattered discussions about poetry, though we do not have a book that contains exclusively the views of Plato on poetry. We do not have such book. There are so many scattered discussions about poetry. But to begin with, it was the first reference of poetry in its emphatic form in Plato's book comes in Ion, the book that he wrote, in dialogic form. We all know that Plato used dialogic form, and his disciple Aristotle did not use dialogic form. Even there also you have some kind of notional difference. I'll talk about that when we come to Aristotle. So in the book Ion, we have the first reference to art in general, and poetry in particular, of course. And we know that Plato employed his master Socrates as his mouthpiece or spokesperson.
Yeah.
So it was through Socrates that Plato tried to propose his ideas. So we have a dialogue between Socrates and the Raspode. And we know that in Greek period, there were singers and they were given the name Raspodes. And they used to be the reciters of poetry at public places. So we have a dialogue in Ion between Socrates and Raspode. Raspode argues that he knows everything about Homer's poetry. And then Socrates starts drilling. We all know Socratic irony and the way Socrates used to ask questions and then draw out the necessary false conclusions that the other person was involved in too. So this was a very effective technique that was employed in Ion. Socrates finally convinces, turns the tables and convinces Raspode that Raspode is not in any way the specialist in anything. For example, there have been references of carpentry, there have been references of theology, there have been references of all other things, of different kinds of handicraft and all other arts, craft and art. And then Socrates asks him whether he knows everything about all these disciplines. And the answer is, of course, not. So it is this way that Plato tries to prove that poetry has nothing to do with reality and truth, and poetry is more of imaginary, and poetry is not practically useful. This is a kind of prefiguring of the charge that he so seriously makes against his next book called Republic. In Republic, probably we have the first and a very comprehensive formulation of the attacks on poetry that Plato makes. And the attacks are primarily for three reasons. The first attack is for truth. According to Plato, poetry is false, not true. So the first attack is the attack of the falsity, that poetry is not true. The second attack is reality, that poetry is not moral, it is immoral. And the third attack is pragmatic, that is poetry. Plato argues that poetry is not useful practically. It is useless, and not just useless, it is harmful also. Plato doesn't have any objection against the uselessness of poetry. He has the objection against the harmfulness of poetry.
Right.
That is very much important. And like an expert chess player, he makes such beautiful and very dauntless moves that it is very difficult for anyone to counter Plato, because you shall see when he argues, and there is a famous example that we all know that Plato gave of the bed, that the bed is first created in the nature and then it is imitated by the carpenter and then it is imitated by the poet. So according to him, whatever poet writes is actually 3 times removed away from reality. So this removal from reality is clearly an issue. And this has to do with, again, two ideas that Plato was bothered about. One idea is of imitation or mimesis. The
Yes.
other one is his idea of forms.
Yeah.
Plato always believed that ideas are important, they are eternal, they are unceasing, they are perennial, they exist there, they are everlasting. Whereas objects are perishable, they are not eternal, they go on changing. So we have this changelessness and change kind of binary that he works out. And it is in this binary that he classifies poetry to be constantly changing, to be constantly moving on, and not eternal. So we have changelessness and change.
Yeah.
He argues that philosophy is something which deals with the eternal, the changeless, the unchanging. It deals with unchanging, it deals with eternal. Whereas poetry doesn't do that. Poetry is moving. Again, to bring this to a very simple understanding, we can say that poetry deals with things, philosophy deals with ideas. That is there. And things are created and things are likely to perish. They are likely to terminate, after some time. They are not lasting. Whereas philosophy is not, because philosophy is based on ideas. And ideas live permanently, and ideas work as the source of everything in the world. So Plato was taking poetry towards ideas, and he found that poetry was not living up to the standards that he was setting for the eternity, the beauty, and the truth. So according to him, poetry did not pass the test that he had made mandatory for. The other thing is, we all know that Plato was looking upon poetry or art in general to contribute towards the cultivation of virtues for making citizens ideal. And he found that poetry was not doing this. On the other hand, poetry was nourishing passions and emotions. In a way, poetry was putting poison into the young minds, and then there was every chance that young people would deviate from the standards and norms, and that would lead to chaos. So you shall see that he was raising another charge of chaos against poetry. That poetry for him would create all kind of anarchy and chaos. Anarchy is the word that Plato used for the first time in the entire history. So you shall see it goes on this way, and we have these some of the important charges that Plato raised against poetry. And you shall see that these charges are so potent, they have been so strong, that till this date we have been struggling very hard to counter them and to establish the utility of, efficacy of, the aesthetic pleasure of, the morality of, the truthfulness of poetry. That is what we can say about that.
Sir, but can we say that here itself there was a kind of seed sown for the birth of Aristotle when Plato was doing that?
Yeah, very true. Very true. Otherwise, Aristotle would not have dealt so seriously with art and poetry in general. We have to start with that, though there is not a direct reference to Plato in Aristotle's writing about poetry and literature, art. But then it is quite obvious, and scholars have come out with the conclusion that Aristotle was retorting he was answering back to the questions that Plato had raised against poetry. And that is obvious, of course, because Aristotle thought in a very different way and probably in a very proper perspective. If you ask me to differentiate between Plato and Aristotle, I would say Plato was interpreting poetry, looking at poetry from a wrong perspective, a perspective he should not have adopted towards poetry. Aristotle was perhaps the first philosopher, theorist of the first order who set the proper perspective to understand poetry. So if you ask me who is the first proper critic in the established sense of the term, literary critic, it is Aristotle, undoubtedly. because Aristotle was not just a critic, he was a theorist. In the sense that he laid down the foundations on which the whole structure of literature and art was firmly set. So he drew the overarching pattern of
Right.
art, So it is in that sense the credit goes to Aristotle. And it is quite interesting that Aristotle was a multi-talented, a multidisciplinary theorist.
Yeah.
We know that he had some similar ideas in politics, in culture, in theology, in philosophy, in medicine, in mathematics, in all disciplines for that matter, which were existing in his times, and even art and poetry also. Aristotle can be credited at least for two reasons. He was, as I said, he proposed the theory, the necessary foundation on which we can understand poetry in its proper sense, and also we can establish the necessary utility and truthfulness of poetry on one hand, and at the same time Aristotle was also responsible for giving to us the necessary vocabulary and terminology that we have today.
Yeah.
So theory and terminology
Both.
of poetry in particular and art in general, was provided to us by Aristotle. This
Sir,
is
actually,
putting it in very nutshell.
Yeah. Actually, we keep on discussing Aristotle for maybe 6 months, next 6 months also. But I would like to draw your attention to that very contentious issue of catharsis, because understanding Aristotle's other concepts are quite, in a way, not, I should say, easy, but at least we can make some attempt and we can understand them. But this catharsis is a kind of problem for all of us, because he has not explained that anywhere in the poetics, or might be the pages are lost. So how do you look at catharsis? That is my a question. And that catharsis idea reflects on the entire issue of criticism, according to you.
Yeah. It is true that he did not go into the explanation of this term catharsis, and that there have been a lot of arguments over the meaning of catharsis, what catharsis is. But then if we relate it to the medicine, and some critics have done that catharsis can be understood as a kind of purgation.
Yeah.
It is a kind of relief
Cleansing.
that we it is a kind of relief that we experience after taking certain dose, medically speaking. So we can argue then, these are of course argumentations, these are only the arguments or tentative propositions that we can make about catharsis, because we do not have any authentic explanation by Aristotle himself. So we do not have anything directly from the horse's mouth. Everything that we have is nothing else but a guesswork. But still we can go into some kind of understanding of this term. Catharsis, as I said, is something which we can look upon as a relief. And because tragedy has, Aristotle was thinking tragedy in terms of two things, at least to me. One, the cause, the other, the effect. So the cause was, of course, conflict, and the effect was the relief. And it was not in the tragedy that the relief could be relished, could be experienced. The relief could be experienced as the effect of, towards the conclusion of tragedy, the effect could be realized. Because tragedy was raising problems and not providing solutions in any sense of the term, as far as work is concerned. But we are not talking about its work, we are talking about its influence over the audience. We have to understand that. So let us take it from the work towards the audience. I think the discussion of catharsis should be taken into the frame of the influence that tragedy can have over audience in place of work. So let us not go for tragedy. Let us go for the influence of tragedy over the audience. And I think Aristotle was perhaps referring to that as to what kind of influence tragedy could have over the audience. And it was, according to him, the cathartic influence. And the reason why he introduced perhaps this term was that poetry in general and tragedy in particular was useful. It was this usefulness, this utility, that we are relieved of our pains, we are relieved of our problems, and that it gives us the feeling of calm, the feeling of serenity, the feeling of peace of mind, the feeling that that something which is so burdensome over us is taken off, because there have been identical reflections, identical representations on the stage, and that we can identify ourselves, and it is after our identification with the protagonist on the stage that we feel that we are relieved.
Yeah.
So it is in that context that we have to understand catharsis.
So in
but
that
then,
sense,
as you know, I was somewhat hazy in talking about this. This is because this is a very darker area, and needs to be understood in the proper perspective. And critics have been trying to bring that perspective to the text even today.
So in this sense,
second point, I think. Second point that I think you were talking about was, what is the influence of catharsis over criticism? And that is again very important, because critics have suffered and troubled. They have taken a lot of troubles, and they have suffered a lot also. In the first place, interpreting the term, and in the second place, trying to draw out its influence over the entire history of literature.
Right.
Criticism wise, we can understand that till Samuel Johnson, we shall feel the influence of catharsis.
Okay.
Even till Eliot, we shall feel the influence of catharsis. As long as modern criticism is there, not the postmodern, not the post-structural, or even not structural, the Aristotelian effect has been there. Even in new criticism, you shall see that there has been an influence of catharsis, that they have not been able to come out of that. That is it, I think.
And sir, this is probably the first, he was the first in a way critic who thought about the effect of work on readers. So which later on we call it as reader response or reception theory kind of thing.
Of course. Of course.
Sham, you
in
have
a way you can find, in a way you can find the seeds of all critical approaches in Aristotelian theory. We can do that.
Sham, you have some question on value, I think, of classicism. So we can take that and end this session.
What were the values or the principles that form the classical approach towards criticism?
Classicism was about objectivity, about reason, about decorum, about art, about craft, about universality. These were some of the principles that formed classical approach. And there was something called classicist. So there was an elevation of certain ideas. So in a way, from the modern point of view, we can say that this was somewhat hierarchical, because there was an element of elitism also present in all this, because there was a distinction between the high and the low, the good and the bad, the sublime and the non-sublime, the pure and impure, the true and the false. So this kind of dichotomy was always there, and that provided the necessary inputs to the emergence and establishment of classicism, I think. But if you ask me the single most important characteristic of or value of classicism, I would say it is objectivity.
Sir,
followed by reason.
Towards the end of this session, I would like to just ask you that in 2020 now, for example, when we are almost now modern, or even people are talking about death of theory, how relevant all these classical ideas are in today's perspective?
We have two answers for this. This is a very vital question and a very contentious as well. Vital because we draw so many things from the classical antiquity, and contentious because critics and theorists after 1960s have raised serious and grave doubts against the classical notions. But then, as I said, we can have at least two approaches towards this question. We can look at this question from 2 points of view. One is, yes, we have drawn some of the important ideas from classicist thinkers, so we must continue with the kind of ideas. For example, objectivity can be a question. Objectivity can be a point in discussion. Reason can be a point in discussion. For example, rationality can be a point in discussion. These are some of the values that we have to take into account, even though we are going to discard them. In 2020 also, this is relevant, I think.
Yeah, correct.
The second approach is, even these terms are not relevant. We all know that post-structuralists and modern critics have raised serious doubts against reason, against objectivity, against universality, against decorum, against everything that was classicist.
Truth also.
The traditionalist. But you have to maintain a very balanced approach, I believe. One example I shall give you, and we shall end with that. Terry Eagleton has been a famous Marxist critic. We all know. And he lives even today. And he wrote a book about how the theory is dead. That we all know.
Yeah.
But then, if you ask Eagleton what kind of Marxist approach he would like to exercise as far as literature is concerned, he gave the caution. He cautioned the Marxist critics that they should maintain the proper Marxist perspective to interpret. So not that everything that was put in the name of Marxism should be applied to literature. And he wrote a wonderful book by the title How to Read a Poem, in which he argues that we have to understand the aesthetic side of poetry as well.
Right.
And aesthetic and formal side of the poetry, and not just the social and contextual side of poetry. So somewhere he was trying to strike the balance between two opposing approaches.
Right.
I think that is a very wise way to look at classicism as well, to look at the classical approaches. We have been alerted by the postmodern and post-structural ideas, and that is quite fine that we have these serious doubts and skeptical ideas as well. But at the same time, we have to retain that traditional approach as also, because that has given us some kind of clarity towards looking at certain things.
Right.
That is what I think.
Right.
As students and researchers, we should do this.
Absolutely.
So long as we do not turn into theorists, we shall continue with this kind of finely balanced approach towards classicism and present day ideas.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for making a very pinpointed kind of references to classicism. Of course, this is not enough. We all know every topic of classicism, every concept of classicism requires a lot of deliberation. But of course, this is just a kind of trailer that we are presenting. So I hope, friends, you are enjoying this kind of deliberation with Dr. Anand Kulkarni. And in coming episodes, we will continue to explore different facets of literary criticism, to begin with, of course, traditional criticism. So I thank you, Dr. Anand Kulkarni, for sparing your time and enlightening us. And I urge all the audience to keep watching these videos and, of course, endorsing us. Thank you very much.